think we're good to go. Okay, perfect. So yeah, this is a really important opportunity. I'm very happy to be here to be able to talk and present on a couple of items, and really the goal of this is to start a conversation today and continue with the conversation and be part of a wider community across the world. This is happening in 50 countries right now today. And World Suicide Prevention Day has been recognized since 2003. The World Health Organization has been recognizing for several years as well. And like I mentioned, it really provides the opportunity for people across the globe to raise awareness of suicide and suicide prevention. The core theme for this year's event and campaign is working together to prevent suicide, to connect communities across countries. And that's essentially what we're doing here with this live stream, is that we have people from all across Canada within the Irish community or outside the community who are tuning in to have a conversation. Now, the real magic happens when it's a conversation. Just with my background, National Social Care Advisor for the Irish Canadian Emergency Centre, and I work in mental health, I feel that there are some items that I really just want to talk about. It might be helpful with my experience to talk about them just for educational purposes, and stimulate some questions maybe. And that's really where the beauty of this is that if you have questions, I want to encourage, you can put them in the chat box. You can let Laura know or the moderators know, and we can get them at the end. So I'd encourage anybody who had pre-existing questions before they came here, or anything that I talk about that they wanted to ask me a question about, then let's do that at the end. This is really hard stuff to talk about. We all likely know someone. We have a friend, a family member, a colleague, a patient that has died by suicide, but it's a very necessary conversation. And I'm going to be talking briefly about suicide, its prevalence, the risk factors, some of the warning signs, but most importantly, how preventable it is and how we can actually do that. So before I really proceed, I want everybody to feel comfortable. It's important to highlight that the sensitivity of this conversation might be difficult for some people. There'd be nothing personal really, but sometimes in these type of conversations, it might bring up some emotions for people. So please feel free that if you need to step away at any point, do that. I would encourage you to do that. So suicide, in terms of sort of defining it and really trying to understand it, it's quite difficult, really. And there's no sort of definition that we sort of look towards in terms of what it looks like. A lot of that is simply because, the research about it and the sort of prevalence of it and who it impacts really changes, over years. But suicide, it means ending your own life. And it sometimes is a way for people to escape pain or escape suffering. We talk about a cry for help. A lot of people who have died by suicide, unfortunately, they might not have got the help in time. And people who have attempted suicide, it's a cry for help to say, I need support. And that's very important to highlight. It's so difficult to individually predict a suicide. It occurs across all ages, incomes, ethnicities, and no one really fully understands why. And most often, people typically experience suicidal thoughts or suicidal ideations when they have lost hope. They see no other way out. They feel trapped, they feel cornered, and they only see black and white. Suicide attempts can also be an impulsive act, and such as ones that might follow the use of substance abuse, particularly alcohol, for example. Where people are inhibited, they're not able to regulate their actions or their mood, or people might have a mental health concerns such as psychotic illness like schizophrenia, where they may hear voices that are commanding them or telling them to harm themselves. On average, there are 11 people that die a day by suicide in Canada, and it's the 9th leading cause of death in Canada. It's extremely hard to predict suicide as it occurs across all age populations. But what we do know is that with 15 to 24-year-olds, suicide accounts for 24% of all deaths. That's 1/4 in Canada. In 2009, I just want to draw attention to this because I think it's important with the current sort of context. 2.5% of Canadians reported having suicidal thoughts. In comparison, the same survey this year has found that 6% of Canadians experienced thoughts or feelings of suicide. That's a massive jump. And you know, I think in the current climate, without full evidence to support this, I think COVID has probably contributed to a lot of that percentage and that increase. And we can talk more about that, because I'm going to talk about risk factors. When I talk about the risk factors, you sort of start to understand more in terms of how COVID potentially might put somebody at risk. In order to understand how we want to prevent suicide, it's important to understand fully the risk factors. And essentially, risk factors are characteristics that make it more likely that individuals will consider, attempt, or potentially die by suicide. And it shouldn't be looked at from a static perspective. And what I mean about that is that the more information we have about a person, the better chance we have of preventing. So we look at historical information as a risk factor. You know, things like an already existing mental health diagnosis, maybe something that has been diagnosed several years ago, or maybe when they were younger, past suicidal ideations. Adversity in a person's life as well, such as a traumatic event. But risk factors, when we talk about risk factors, are probably more important when we talk about the current, you know, in terms of acute risk factors and warning signs that are really present today. And warning signs can, in my perspective and how I look upon them, is they come from an emotional, cognitive, actionable, and social lens. So when I mean that, I mean, you know, warning signs typically we notice that people are sudden change in their mood or behavior. You know, people often sort of, you know, talk about depression, and yeah, it puts people certainly at a high risk. But depression shows itself in many ways. It isn't just about feeling sad or feeling down. People feel hopeless, people lack energy, people lack interest, they lack optimism. And there's other physiological representations as well in terms of poor appetite and poor sleep. So it's important to understand that, you know, an emotional lens is important, but from a cognitive and a behavioral perspective as well, it's important to understand the warning signs for trying to identify somebody who potentially might be at risk. Other areas that we tend to consider or look towards is an increase in substance use. And I mentioned alcohol in particular. Isolating, and I want to talk a bit more about this. And especially people who start to withdraw from other people, that's a sign. People who withdraw from activities that they previously enjoyed, that's also a sign. So maybe somebody who's part of the GA community, and you know, maybe they're seeing things or you haven't heard from them in a while and they're not coming out to training anymore, or have missed a year. Maybe they have legitimate reasons, but if you know that the reasons aren't as legitimate as they should be, you know, withdrawing from these types of activities and isolating is typically something that might raise an eyebrow or be a warning sign to be aware of. COVID unfortunately has sort of heightened that due to the physical distancing and social distancing measures that we now have in place. They're sort of forcing people to sort of remove themselves from the wider community. And it's been a tough time for a lot of people. Other things that we could really identify and be aware of are social changes in somebody's life. And again, COVID has really sort of heightened that in many areas. So loss of a job, relationship issues, maybe the death of a loved one, or sort of marriage concerns. I already mentioned relationship concerns. So those are typically some of the risk factors that we can look towards from a historical context, and but more acute, more immediate, current warning signs or risk factors that I spoke about there. The risk for suicide can be reduced, and the vast majority of people who have suicidal thoughts or who have attempted suicide do not die by suicide. Many people recover from these experiences and live a full and meaningful life. It is very preventable. And one area I want to talk about in terms of prevention is what we're doing right now. Is talking about and having a conversation. Having honest, open, and responsible conversations about suicide helps remove stigma. The topic of suicide is unfortunately fraught with stigma and myths that lead to prejudice and discrimination. But it doesn't have to be this way. We can start breaking down the barriers by being more open and talking about it like we're doing here. It is traditionally taboo, the beliefs that talking about suicidal ideation can worsen those thoughts, but there is growing evidence that counters that being more open, being more responsible conversations about suicidal ideation can lead to a higher chance of being able to prevent deaths. Even though we don't mean to, the language that we use and the words that we use is actually very important when we're tackling stigma. Because sometimes when we use language that we don't intend to use, it can reinforce the stigma that prevents people from reaching out. We all need to do much better as a community, as health professionals even. An example that we need to be more careful about is how we really describe how somebody dies by suicide. We often hear the word committed suicide, which actually implies as if the person suicide is a crime. But by using more neutral phrases such as died by suicide, it removes the blame and shame element. And that's very important for people who are currently struggling with mental health problems, or anybody who has had suicidal ideations. My advice really is sort of to remove anything that reinforces stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination against people who may be having suicidal ideation. So to tackle this and to make it more preventable, we need to tackle the stigma. And we need to talk more about it and have these conversations. And we need to be more careful about what words we use, that we don't reinforce stereotypes or prejudice or discrimination. I want to talk about more in terms of sort of protective factors and what we can do for ourselves to improve our mental well-being. I'm going to, if there's anything sort of you walk away with here, I want you to remember, take 5. And it's only take 5 minutes to talk to someone if they're okay, or if you're not okay, reach out to somebody. When I say take 5, I also mean take 5 steps. And the first one is to educate yourself more. Do more to learn the signs. And that's the purpose of today, is to talk to more people. Be more aware of the signs. Your ability to identify the signs will better prepare you to take action, and it could help save a life. This is a community effort. It's very much a local community effort. Know how to help people. Again, another educational element. Don't be afraid to ask your friend if they're having thoughts of suicide, and also educating yourself on how to get them help. We all need to be better at times with our self-care. And our mental health is crucial to our overall long-term health. I would encourage regular exercise, doing activities that you get pleasure out of. This might be doing something good for somebody, making yourself feel good that you did that, learning new skills, maybe learning a new language. We need to find pleasure in our life. We need to maintain that as often as we can. The fourth one of the 5 is to reach out. If you or someone you know is in emotional distress, you must reach out for the help. You're not alone. By talking with someone, we sit with them and we share their pain, and that's key. As therapists, people come to me to talk, but they're allowed to share their pain, to talk about it. By doing this, we are more likely to prevent further action by the person. The person doesn't feel alone, and by sharing, they start to understand and validate the feelings that they aren't alone. It's not just them. Positive social supports is a hugely important protective factor. So encourage people to reach out, or if you need to, reach out to somebody and have a conversation. And probably the key to today as well is to spread the word, about having a conversation. Make it more aware. Let's get people talking. Share this campaign going forward. It's local communities that really make the difference, but this shouldn't be a one-off conversation. It should happen every single day. If people are in need of any support or any resources, when they sort of walk away from here and need more information, we have a lot of resources in the Irish Canadian Immigration Centre website. We have a dedicated mental health resource section. You can read a lot more in terms of where to get help. There's a lot of very good educational points as well. And my contact details are there, and Gillian Goulding's contact details are there. So I'm the social care advisor here in Toronto, and Gillian does likewise in Vancouver. And really, if people reach out to us, we tend to give people the best support in a timely and efficient manner, to the best of our knowledge, and signpost and direct them to where we feel that they'll get the best treatment or the best help that they need and support that they need. It goes without saying that, don't delay anything if you feel that it's more imminent and urgent. If somebody does reach out to you, or you feel that you need to make movement a lot sooner, don't wait. The action to take is call 911 or go to your nearest emergency department. So I really just want to finish it off on that, and encourage anybody that, this is about a conversation. It's about being more open and being more honest and being more responsible about being able to talk about this. And I think from from that point and from that end, I'm gonna stop there. If there's any questions, let's have, let's have this conversation if there's anybody that wants to ask anything. Laura.
So we've one question just came in there that's asking, why do you think suicide is higher amongst males versus females?
That's a good question. A lot of the research and a lot of the evidence that we have that would support that is that males tend to use a more lethal method than females. So therefore the rates of completion or dying by suicides, it occurs more often because of that. Females do have more attempts at suicide, but the reason why the rate is higher with men, one of the key factors that we have on understanding is that they tend to have methods that are much more severe in what they use. Sorry, I think you're in mute, Laura. Is there a question?
Well, it hasn't come in yet, but one thing that might be useful for people to hear is, what would you recommend doing if you do have concerns about one of your friends and you want them to talk to you, but they're not really talking? Like, what do you do at that point? Do you continue to try and get to talk? Do you maybe reach out to somebody else? Like, what would you do in that situation?
I'll give you a scenario where, I advise people to, on a step process really in terms of how to do this, and it's ask, are you okay? It's a simple question. Is the first thing, and ways in which might sort of help with that is identify observations. When you're going to ask, I notice you haven't been yourself lately. I notice you were crying the other night and sobbing. I notice you're not hanging out with us much more. Are you okay? So provide that sort of evidence as to why and back it up with that. But ultimately, you're really sort of asking, are you okay? I always tell people, if you have that sort of gut feeling and you have all the warning signs and you're identifying that somebody's at that point, you sort of like weigh up the pros and cons of, like, what if I ask and they take offense to it and they back off? Okay, I'll back off, but at least I've broken in and I've taken that first step and I've opened that door and opened that window, that they know I'm concerned and I'm observing this and I know something might not be right. You may be wrong. I'd rather take the risk, and I'd rather sort of ask that question, are you okay? And how you do it can be important. Prepare yourself as well. Fill yourself with the information maybe that I talked about, the warning signs, the risks. Educate yourself and put yourself in a good position. Plan for it as well. Just don't sort of ring the person, but maybe if you're sitting down watching TV with them in the living room, or you're watching a film or something where it's comfortable and quiet and confidential as well, I would encourage that. Listen to them. Try not to push action is sort of the next thing I would advise. Some people can back off at that point, like you said, Laura. People might be standoffish and deny it. Sort of the first question opens that door up, and then just listen. As humans, we really want to problem solve. That's what we want to do. We want to help people. We want to get to the bottom of things and give them solutions. And because of that, we tend to say it's okay, it's all right. We don't know how they feel, so we can't really say that. We don't fully understand that. So sit back and listen will be the second thing I would say. The third one will be encourage action if you can. There's support here. There's somebody maybe that if you want to reach out to or have their number, you can go on the Irish Canadian Immigration Centre website. You can send an email. You can go on a confidential chat line where nobody's not going to judge you. They're not going to, look at you in any sort of light. But at least you get to talk to somebody that way. So there's encourage action as much as you can. And if you get to that sort of stage in that point, encouraging them to take action, check in more often. You've already asked them, are you okay? You're allowed to do it again. It could be a quick text thereafter. It could be another conversation or a phone call. So really the sort of steps which I would take is to have that conversation is ask, are you okay? Back it up with observations and evidence that, I just sense something's not right. Listen to them. Don't push action. Encourage the action is the third one, and really sort of check in as often as you can thereafter, especially if you feel that, they're not doing well.
Thank you for that. That's really good advice. I think it would have been useful for everybody. So we have a question just came in there. Do you think there's anything that the government or local authorities can effectively do to prevent suicide?
Yeah, it's in a lot of ways now, I don't want to be too polarizing with this or too controversial, but I would say absolutely it's the stigma around it has to change, and how do we word that and how we talk about You know, maybe media has to play a part in that as well. Maybe there's a conversation there. But I certainly think the action really has to happen as well at a local level, you know, among your own community too. You know, healthcare professions will sort of help people, but we're sort of at a point where people has reached out and they need treatment potentially at that stage. You know, it's really good to get to somebody at an earlier stage. So from a community level, it's the local community that can really help, and that's where we're having this. You know, it's having a conversation with somebody at the GA club, it's having a conversation with somebody at a music event, or it's having a conversation with somebody that you know over coffee. That's how we really sort of get this moving. And you know, funding goes a long way, absolutely, from a federal and provincial level. You know, I think COVID has sort of opened up more opportunities in the sense that we're using now video platforms, quite effective for a lot of people in a lot of ways. But, you know, I think more needs done in terms of money. I think more needs done in terms of sort of the resources that we have access to. We can't wait on that. We don't know how long we're going to be waiting on. So I always think about how do we take initiative ourselves, and it really should happen with the local community.
Thank you for that. So we have another question here. Are immigrants more susceptible to feelings of despair?
Feelings of despair, did you say? Yeah, you know, certainly marginalized population groups are at higher risk of dying by suicide or having suicidal ideations. Okay, now I'll give you examples. So the refugee and immigrant population group would fall into that. LGBTQ plus community would also fall into that as well. So marginalized groups are at a higher risk. Now, in terms of feeling despair, you know, I think it's more in talking an immigration population group, it's sort of like the isolation that we want to tackle more than anything. Because we're a long way from home, we've left the country, we're trying to assimilate in our new environment, our new meet new people, connect with more people, and you know, loneliness and that isolation is probably more prevalent among immigrants. But that's not just to say that, you know, that doesn't lead to sadness, it doesn't lead to despair, it doesn't lead to frustration. It can and it will. You know, it's how you sort of define it and what word you want to describe what pain somebody's really going through is what I would say. So not necessarily despair, but I would say absolutely, in the sense that immigrants certainly feel a lot more isolated, a lot more lonely because of the move. But, you know, this is to highlight that there is support there. You know, we're having a conversation with people here who are tuning in from across Canada, and we know that there's support there. We know that we have a community there. Although, yes, you might feel lonely and isolated, reach out and talk to somebody. You share that, because I'll guarantee you that we've all experienced that at some point.
So yeah, I'd just like to encourage people to keep sending in their questions. There hasn't been one there in a couple of minutes, but I was wondering, could you mentioned in your presentation at the beginning there sort of ways for self-care, you know, if your sort of friends are experiencing suicidal ideation or if you yourself has lost someone to suicide. Can you expand a little bit more about what people could do for their own mental health after supporting somebody or after losing someone?
Yeah, so one of the most protective factors that we have is keeping connected. You know, in times of sort of like adversity, we do tend to sort of retract and try and cope with things alone. You know, that's maybe just a sort of human instinct. We sort of back off, we corner ourselves, and we try and deal with this emotion and the thoughts and everything that we've just experienced on our own. So keeping connected with your friends or your sort of wider network who's involved, who's also connected, that's key. You know, loss is tough. There's certain stages and there's certain processes that happen, and grieving is one of them. Sometimes people tend to do it alone, but it can go on for a long period of time. If you have a community of support, like a group of friends where somebody has been lost, keep connected. You know, keep talking to each other. You know, the reason why I say that is that, you know, some people might have thoughts that I should have seen it coming, I could have predicted this, should have been more aware, judging themselves negatively for this. And like at the start, I really talked about it. So unpredictable. If this occurs, it's a tragic event. It affects the wider community. So the more you start to think about that and sort of look at your own actions, that you could have done more, it's harder if you don't get a different perspective, i.e. the need for connection, to talk to people and keep talking to people. you get different perspectives, you get more flexible on how you actually think and reflect upon it. So I would say sort of the connection part is probably the most protective factor. Other things you could do as well is just try and maintain exercising, eating, these sort of healthy coping skills that we all do and we all have the capacity to do. As long as you sort of maintain that sort of routine as well, that goes a long way of helping.
Brilliant, thank you for that. Sorry, I thought I saw something come in there, but no. I was really interested in what you said there about different ways that we can overcome stigma, avoiding certain words like committed suicide, etc. And I know for myself, kind of growing up in the west of Ireland, there's definitely a huge stigma, particularly around like male mental health, that not even suicide itself, but, oh, you're a lad, you shouldn't be, what are you doing talking about your feelings kind of thing. And, I think that even if you're living in a different country, if you've moved to Canada, I think sometimes those feelings can travel with you. So aside from us as, kind of a support network wanting to avoid words that further stigmatize people, what would you say to, we'll say, a young person who's struggling with their mental health, but they're afraid of talking to somebody in case they're judged? Like, is there any kind of tips you could give to people in that kind of situation?
The first thing I will say is that you're right in that it's taboo in certain cultures to talk about mental health and how you're feeling. And that's unfortunate, but that's what we're really sort of tackling here. If I had a tip or something that would really encourage a young person is that, you're not alone in the sense that we have been through this type of experience shared, and we understand how you feel. So thinking that you're the only one who is feeling lonely and isolated, you sort of tend to look towards, if you can, other people have been through similar experiences. How did you feel at this point in time? Look, what did you do when you came stuck? Where did you go? Like, these are things that will help you break through that. But by sharing it, you're sharing the pain that you're going through or the emotional experience that you're going through. And when you get that, you feel more validated. You feel like, I'm not alone. So in whatever way that sort of looks like, and what method you have and what sort of capacity you can do that, if there's a fear, it shouldn't exist. We tend to carry that because maybe we grow up in certain community structures, or we have certain beliefs, like I mentioned. That does carry and that does travel, you're correct, but they're not necessarily true to today. So if something was happening in the past, we sort of move forward now, and our life is much more different here. You're in a different place, you're in Canada. You can talk more about these things. You can reach out to your community because you've been through a process that other people have been through. And then when you start to share that and understand that, you start to accept it. You start to accept that I'm not alone.
Great, thank you
Sorry,
for
Laura, I
that.
think you might have been your back. Thank you.
Yeah. Another question here that is how to keep connected during COVID. And I think that kind of throws back to, I remember at the very beginning of an early conversation I had with yourself, where we were trying to talk about the different ways we can get the message out there that social distancing is not the same as social isolation. So maybe if you could speak to that a little bit too, because I think there are still people that are too afraid to go and hang out with groups of friends and so on in the current circumstance.
Yeah, I do. Like, I certainly don't want to go against the grain in terms of what the health authorities are saying. So yeah, like, be very attentive to what advancements there are and what suggestions there are in terms of how do we keep safe from COVID. Okay, I literally think that when the message came out, social distancing, people felt it was literally, don't leave my apartment, don't leave my home, I can't go out there. And I think COVID brings that fear. When we have fear, we have anxiety, we start to worry a bit, and COVID really has heightened a lot of factors. And I mentioned before in different sort of calls with people that a lot of experts, and they're probably right, we're saying that it's like the perfect storm for anxiety. And when I talk about that, I mean that typically the three characteristics of somebody who might be worrying, being very anxious about things, is how predictable something might be, or how unpredictable it might be. So COVID is very unpredictable right now. We're still learning a lot more about it. So it sort of adds to sort of the anxiety, and it kind of forces people. And if you're more anxious, more fearful, you tend not to take risks. When you're more anxious and fearful, we're risk averse. We do not want to do something just in case. And quite literally, I think a lot of people might have taken that at the start. I can't go out there, but we can connect like this, and that's important. We can connect via Zoom, although I think a lot of people at this point might be bored with it and be tired from a lot of the Zoom calls. You have your phone, you can phone somebody as an alternative. You now have different capacities where you can actually go out into a park, you can stay within your bubble. So follow the policies and the health guidelines as they change, but don't think that you're isolated. You're not. You can connect with people, and you can do that through this, and you can do that through your phone. You can reach out to somebody at home as well. This has opened up so many connections, believe it or not. So don't think that you are isolated just because of that. It's more, I think, if you really are going that way, it might be the fear. It might be the fear factor in terms of what COVID is sort of presenting.
Great, thank you. So another question there is, how can a family unit help someone in their own family who is struggling with their mental health? Are there certain things that parents or siblings could do?
It's a good question, really good question. And it aligns with what this conversation has been about tonight, I think, in the sense that we talked a lot about removing the stigma that it's okay to ask, are you okay? You can do that. It's understanding and educating yourself better about the warning signs, the risk factors, the potential sort of concerns when it's more immediate. It's understanding where the person can get help. A huge part of it is education, I will say, in that, but it's also not a healthcare responsibility, really. It's a local community effort and a family effort, where you can have that conversation, and it's not stigma that should be stopping you. If you're not sure, you ask that question, and if you have that sort of gut feeling, encourage, keep sort of persisting with it. Still observing it's not good. I'm seeing signs here that would lend itself that, I'm really concerned, and take it from there, really. So it's what I will say, and just sort of summarize on that, is it's educating yourself, understanding the warning signs more. Don't let the stigma get in the way. We talked about this, how important this is, and ask, are you okay? You're allowed to do that. You're not gonna make things worse by asking that question, by allowing the person to open and talk about it. The research and the evidence is saying that it's working.
Great, thank you for that. Everybody keep sending us your questions. These are brilliant, and Micheál, thank you for answering them all so far. We've kind of touched on this already throughout your talk there, but we've talked about what you can do to support your mental health if your friends are struggling or whatever, but is there anything in particular that you can do if you have lost someone to suicide, and how through your grieving process, is there a way you can sort of avoid the feelings of, I should have known, this is my fault kind of thing, which a lot of people experience when they've lost a friend?
It depends how confident you are as well in doing this. Support groups are really, really important, especially with the grieving process. You have people who will share similar experiences, and that's so vital. I also mentioned that if there's a close community of friends that have experienced the same thing, keep an eye on each other, keep connecting. You might assume or presume that somebody's doing okay, where, like we just talked about, somebody might have thoughts of, well, I could have seen this, I should have seen the warning signs, but really we can't. And like from a professional point of view and all the research that we do, we don't want you to judge yourself if you're in this position. You can't put blame on yourself. There was no intent here on your side that you caused this, you didn't, or that you should have seen it. And we think like that, we tend to sort of blame ourselves, but we shouldn't. And only by understanding that through talking to other people, maybe like a support group or keeping connected with your local community, your local friends, do we fully, buy into that and read into that, okay, yes. Now, again, it takes a process. It takes several stages, maybe. There's no timeline on this, but it's important that you do that. Reach out to groups, reach out to your close-knit community.
Brilliant, thank you for that. I'm just trying to see, have any other questions come in? Just bear with me there now. No, there's nothing else has come in there. So anyone, if there is any more questions you'd like to ask, feel free to put them in. Micheál, is there anything else you'd like to expand on that we've talked about, or any other things you think people should know about? Or if somebody does want to go and educate themselves more, what would be a good starting point for them?
Yeah, good question. And because I'm working for the Irish Canadian Immigration Centre, we have a really good resource page if anybody can access that. We have mental health resources, so we have access to services where if you feel that somebody needs support or you need support, you can start to look at it. It's a good first step. If you want to educate yourself, there's a huge community of organisations across Canada that provide a lot of resources on how you can sort of help yourself. To improve your education. So some of the big ones that I will sort of orient or direct people towards will be CAMH, certainly. They're really important in the work that they do. CMHA, which is the Canadian Mental Health Association, and the Mental Health Commission of Canada, as well as that. So a lot of these would offer like free videos, free tutorials, a lot of education as well. But then on top of that as well, I would also say, like, you can also reach out to your doctor. You can also reach out to a friend. You can also improve your own ability and confidence to take that step. Because one of the hardest things is to have that conversation with somebody if they're not doing okay, or if you want to reach out to somebody as well. So I would say that if you want to do that, a doctor in your community is very important. People trust their doctors. It's a confidential setting, and that should be something as well where people can also get access to a lot of resources and a lot of information to educate yourself.
Great, thank you. So we've had a couple more questions come in there. So the first one is, can support groups be set up voluntarily within communities? Do they need to be led by qualified healthcare practitioners?
Good question. It depends on the service that is going to be given. In that, is it direct intervention is one thing, as in, is the support group got people who are providing an intervention, i.e. psychotherapy, for example? Are they regulated professionals, which is one thing that sort of, you want to be aware of, because, if somebody's not qualified or regulated or part of a college, then and they're trying to give that sort of direct intervention, it can get a bit tricky. It's absolutely okay to set up your own support group among your friends if you feel that there's a need there. If you want to create a website, if you want to create like a blog, if you want to create something where people meet and have a coffee more consistently, we see this happening all the time. If it's counsel, if it's support and information, if it's just for somebody to sort of check in and be present, fine. I would say that's okay. And if you want to read up more on that, I would read up more on sort of the guidelines of the different colleges in your province that you're living in terms of like what can and can't be done professionally or legally. But I think that's a great idea. If somebody has an idea in terms of sort of like creating a community, a shared community where we can share information, we can share knowledge, we can bring people together, go for it. Go for it.
Great, thank you. And then we have a question: how should you respond to or support someone who tells you they've suffered a loss in their family through suicide?
Another really good question. And it does sort of go with what I've already said, is that make sure that you're visible, that you can support them, if that's what the question really is. So how do I support somebody who has lost a family member? Or maybe the question was, Laura, sorry, how do I support the family? Is it?
Yeah, so how would you respond or support someone who tells you they've suffered a loss in their family through suicide? So I guess maybe, what would your initial reaction be, and then how do you support them from there?
Yeah, ask, are you okay? That's the first question. How are you doing? How are you coping with it? How are you, and maybe extend it to the rest of your family in terms of how you're doing. Offer that opportunity where, I'm here, I can talk to you, at least I'm that option, I'm that sort of outlet where you can connect with somebody. And then you can check in with them more often, because we really don't know in an individual aspect how somebody's going to respond and react. So being a good friend, those are the things that I would definitely encourage. If you have knowledge, if you have that information where somebody can go and get help, and the family needs support, provide them with it. People might not be that knowledgeable. They might not realize what exists and what they can get access to. And you can encourage that as well, because it's really part of the stigma that we want to address here. And that take action, talk more about it. It's okay to feel how you feel, but this is where you can go and get the help if you need it.
Brilliant. Nothing else has come in there, but if there's one, if there's one takeaway you'd like somebody watching to take from tonight, what would you say that is?
Yeah, this is created because it's now a recognized day specifically to talk about this. It isn't created to just stop after today. We need to have this conversation every day. I see it every day because I work in this setting all the time, and it's encouraging, that these events are being recognized, but we need to share this more often, have a conversation more often. And I think that's probably the most important thing I would say.
All right, so I'm just getting some questions by text message as well. So this person is asking, what are the main reasons that people have suicidal thoughts? Is COVID playing a big part in this? For example, unemployment, lack of social interaction, etc. Do you think there's been an upsurge during this time?
Yeah, I'll answer to the last one. And, one of the statistics that I brought forward at the start was that in 2019, a survey was conducted, and 2.5% of Canadians reported having suicidal thoughts in 2019. And in comparison to this year, the exact same survey, it is found that 6% of Canadians have now experienced thoughts or suicidal ideation. Now, we can put that down to a number of things, but I certainly think that because of the effects and the consequences that COVID has had, it's probably heightened that number, unfortunately. So yeah, I think, I don't want to say conclusively that it is COVID alone, but it's a huge event that's occurred in our lives for everybody, and it has consequences with it, and that sort of lends itself to what might put somebody at more risk of dying by suicide or suicidal ideation. Now, clinically, a lot of people think if somebody has depression, it is a huge factor, but sort of characteristics of depression can differ. And typically, we look at a lot of things that might contribute to somebody's mental well-being. And why now? Like, what are the problems? What's occurring? We look at that from a really, broad lens. And it can be contributed from predisposing factors, being born into a family maybe that has a history of mental health problems. You might be born into a family that has access to poor medical services or mental health services. You might have a medical illness from a very young age. You're sort of predisposed from an early stage. The other thing is precipitating events play a huge role. So we talk about precipitating events, adversity that occurs. Some people might experience a loss early on in their life. They might not adjust to it. The parents might get divorced. I'm just talking about sort of different events. It might be a traumatic event. We might have refugees in the context where they're coming to Canada because they're fleeing from a war zone. That's traumatic. That's a huge event. Typically like a precipitating event. And then what's keeping it going is another factor. Like, what's maintaining these problems? No access to medical services, no access to mental health, poor protective factors, in terms of no community of support, tend to keep them going. And all of these sort of combine in terms of what we use in terms of a historical perspective, and sort of as the lifetime of a person moves on, events that have occurred, what's keeping it going, and a lack of protective factors to improve it.
So nothing else has come in there, but I suppose one final question from me, I guess, if nothing else comes in, but one final question from me is, in Ireland every year we do the Darkness into Light walk, which I think has done a huge amount of, it's done a vast amount of work in getting the message out there that, if you are like suffering with suicidal ideation, if you're having thoughts of self-harm or whatever, and it's another day where everybody gets to think about that. And obviously that's been kind of cancelled this year, unfortunately, and it's just kind of down to like online events. But is there anything similar? Are there any similar countrywide actions in Canada that people can get involved with that way?
Really good question. And I think at the minute it's hard because of the group thing, in terms of the sort of the bubble, and sort of how many people you can interact with. And we're seeing a lot of things cancelled because of that. Sports it's a huge vehicle in terms of being able to promote these type of things, and Darkness in the Light, the walk, people will be able to come together in groups is hugely important. But there are a lot of online campaigns that are running every year, which I think people can get involved with. You can be a volunteer. You know, Bell Let's Talk. We have Mental Health Awareness Week. We have World Suicide Prevention Day that we're talking about here. We have a Men's Health Week. We have these type of events that we can become more involved with that will allow you to raise more awareness, to get involved, to push it forward. Because, you know, it's not just about, today is very important, it's about suicide, talking about and having that conversation, but it's the other things about mental health as well, and the other areas that we need to be more proactive about as well, and talking about these.
Thank you. And actually, sorry, we did just get another question in there. Aware of any services or counsellors in Canada that are able to work with immigrants as Gaeilge?
In specific language, Irish language, you know, not in Canada, but there is, I think it's Cavru. I'll have to just double check that. They're based, I think, out of Galway, maybe, that they did provide a service to, I don't know if it extended to Canada. Now, I can follow up with that question, having the full information. They definitely did provide to the Irish diaspora living in Australia. I know that at one point. I just haven't checked in on the service lately. What I will say is that there's a lot of really good services that have popped up for immigrants who are not just Irish. You know, there's a lot of immigrants from across the world that come to Canada that serve the immigrant population group. So it might be in different languages, right? And that does exist across the GTA. It exists across Canada. That's a resource that I can give to anybody. I just haven't everything off the top of my head in terms of where they are and where, you know, sort of costs and sort of referral process. But if anybody wants, you can get me information on the website. You can reach out. I can follow up with an email with all of this information.
Perfect. I was just going to say that if the person wants to email the embassy, we can pass it on. Or if you want to email Micheál directly, your information is on that mental health page on it.
My number's there in my email address. So anybody that wants to follow up with some questions, if you're not comfortable asking them now, or if it's, you know, information or a bit of direction, you know, reach out. You know, I'm more than happy to help.
Great, thanks. And obviously, same for the embassy as well. You know, we do have consular staff and we do an awful lot of work with ICANN. A lot of questions that come in that might be, you know, kind of beyond our areas of expertise, we'll always reach out to Kathy or Micheál and ask for kind of further guidance there. So between the two organizations, hopefully we'll be able to, you know, give you support these situations. Yeah. But I think that is it for the questions. So I would like to thank firstly all the viewers for your really insightful questions that you've asked tonight. I'd like to thank Micheál very sincerely for giving us your time this evening and for helping us to mark what is a very important occasion. And I think especially for Irish people, because I think, you know, a lot of us will have been kind of touched by this issue at some point in our lives. So we just want to say thank you very much. And like I said, if anyone has anything they want to follow up on, you can email the embassy, you can email Micheál, and we will try and get an answer to your question for you. So thanks very much, everybody. And thank you, Micheál.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Laura. This is great. Thank you. Keep safe, everyone.